Harold Whitmore closed his eyes on a Tuesday morning and didn't open them again for 31 days. Not because he'd lost his sight, because there was one thing his money had never been able to show him: who his sons really were when they thought he couldn't see them at all. "Dad, sit down, you're scaring us." Marcus, the eldest, was already on his phone before Harold finished lowering himself into the chair. "I'm calling Dr. Ferris right now." "There's no rush," Harold said, staring at a point just past his son's shoulder, careful not to focus on anything. "The doctor said it could be gradual. Weeks, maybe longer." Derek, the middle son, checked his watch. "I've got a flight at 4. Call me with updates." Only Jake, the youngest, crouched down in front of him. "Dad, look at me. Can you see anything at all?" Harold looked directly into his son's eyes and said nothing. By that evening, Marcus had already called the family lawyer twice. Harold heard both calls through the study door, phone pressed too tight against an ear that assumed a blind man couldn't hear as well as he used to. "If Dad's really losing his sight, we need power of attorney sorted before this gets complicated," Marcus said. "I'm not letting Derek's lawyer touch this first." Harold sat very still in the hallway, listening to his eldest son plan around him like furniture being rearranged. 1 minute and 20 seconds. For the first week, Marcus visited twice, both times with documents, both times leaving within 20 minutes of arriving. Derek called exactly once, apologized for being busy, and didn't call again. Neither of them asked what it felt like. Neither of them stayed for dinner. Jake came every single evening. He didn't bring paperwork. He brought a battered paperback he'd owned since college and started reading it out loud after dinner. 1 chapter a night, never asking Harold to acknowledge it, never checking if he was even listening. If you think the way someone treats you when they assume you can't do anything for them tells you everything about who they are, hit like right now, because in 3 weeks one of Harold's sons was about to prove that completely wrong, and it wasn't the one anyone would have guessed. On day 12, Marcus arrived with a specialist Harold hadn't agreed to see. A real ophthalmologist, brought in without warning to confirm the diagnosis before the estate paperwork moved forward. Harold's stomach dropped the second the man walked in with an eye chart under his arm. He had 4 minutes before the exam started to decide whether 31 days of this was about to end in the worst possible way. Caught in front of the son who'd only ever wanted the paperwork settled faster. The specialist held up 3 fingers, then 2, watching Harold's eyes closely for the smallest flicker of focus. Harold stared past his hand at the wall behind him, forcing his pupils not to track the movement, sweat gathering at his collar despite the cool room. "There's some residual light perception," the doctor finally said, packing up his instruments, "consistent with early-stage macular degeneration. I'd recommend a follow-up in a month." Marcus was already texting the lawyer before the doctor reached the door. That night, Jake read 3 chapters instead of 1. Harold's breathing had gone shallow after the exam, and Jake, mistaking it for exhaustion, stayed almost 2 hours longer than usual, reading until Harold's shoulders finally relaxed against the chair. "You don't have to stay this long," Harold said quietly. "I know," Jake said, not looking up from the page. "I like reading it anyway. Doesn't matter if you're listening." On day 19, Harold overheard Marcus and Derek on a call together, the first time they'd spoken to each other in weeks, and only because a number needed dividing 3 ways. "Whatever happens with Dad, Jake gets whatever share we all agreed on," Derek said. "He doesn't need to be involved in the decisions. He's never been good with this stuff anyway." Harold sat in the next room holding a coffee cup he could see perfectly well, listening to his sons decide his youngest son's worth in a single sentence, without once mentioning that he'd been in that house every night for 3 weeks. On day 24, Jake brought the paperback again, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. He opened to the bookmark and started reading, same as every night. Poems Harold hadn't heard out loud in over a decade, not since his wife used to read them to him in this exact chair, before the cancer, before any of this began. Jake had no idea. He'd pulled the book off a shelf at random 3 weeks earlier, looking for something to fill the silence. Harold's throat tightened, and for the first time in 24 days, he almost opened his eyes and told him everything. He didn't. On day 29, Marcus called an emergency family meeting to finalize the estate division ahead of schedule. His lawyer had found a loophole that needed signatures before month's end. Derek flew in for exactly 90 minutes. Both of them spoke over Harold's chair like he wasn't sitting in it, dividing properties, accounts, timelines, everything but the one thing that had actually happened in that house for the past month. Jake sat quietly in the corner through the entire meeting, saying nothing, clearly uncomfortable being part of a conversation about money he'd never asked to join. That night, after Marcus and Derek left, Jake stayed for the reading like always. 2 chapters from the end of the book, he paused. "Dad, can I ask you something? Even if you can't really answer." Harold said nothing, waiting. "I don't care what they decide about the house or the accounts," Jake said. "I just don't want you to think nobody stayed. I know I can't fix your eyes. But I didn't want you sitting here alone every night while they figured out spreadsheets." Harold opened his eyes. Jake froze, the book still open in his lap. "Dad? You can see? I never lost it," Harold said quietly. 31 days. I wanted to know who would still show up once there was nothing left to gain by showing up. Jake didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, "That's a horrible thing to do to your kids." "I know," Harold said. "It was the only way I'd ever get a true answer." Harold called Marcus and Derek the following week. Not to punish them, he was clear about that, but to restructure the will in a way neither of them expected. Jake would inherit the house itself, the one place he'd actually shown up to every night for a month. The rest would be split fairly between all 3, exactly as originally planned. Marcus argued for 2 days. Derek stopped calling entirely once the papers were signed. Jake still reads to his father most evenings, not because anyone asked him to anymore, but because 31 nights had turned into a habit neither of them wanted to break. Here's what Harold hasn't told Jake yet. The paperback Jake pulled off that shelf at random, the one he's read from almost every night for months now, it was his mother's book. The exact one she used to read to Harold in that same chair, years before she passed, years before Jake was even old enough to remember her voice clearly. Jake has never noticed the handwriting in the margins of the last chapter. Harold isn't sure if he's ready to watch his son find it. Maybe next time Jake turns that last page, he'll see it himself. Never assume the people who show up with nothing to gain are showing up for nothing. Sometimes the only son who never asked for anything is the only one who was ever really there. If this one got you, tell us in the comments. Should Harold tell Jake about the handwriting before he finds it on his own? Subscribe to Gentle Hearts. We'll see you in the next story.